Book 3, Chapters 2 and 3 of The Fatal Three by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. The Rift in the Lute. The villa was built on a ledge of ground between the road and the sea. There was a stone terrace in front of the windows of salon and dining room, below which the ground shelved steeply down to the rocks and the blue water. The low, irregular-shaped house was screened from the road by a grove of orange and lemon trees, with a peach or a cherry here and there to give variety of colour. In one corner there was a whole cluster of peach trees, which made a mass of purplish pinky bloom. The ridges of garden sloping down from the stone terrace were full of white stalks and scarlet anemones. Clusters of red ranunculus made spots of flame in the sun, and the young leaves in the long hedge of Dijon roses wove an interlacing screen of crimson, through which the sun shone as through old ruby glass in a cathedral window. Everywhere there was a feast of perfume and colour and beauty. The little bay, the curving pier, the white-sailed boats, which, seen from the height above, looked no bigger than the gulls skimming across the blue, the quaint old houses of Villefranche on a level with the water, and rising tier above tier to the crest of the hill, pink and blue houses, white and cream-coloured houses, with pea-green shutters and red roofs. Far away to the left, the jutting promontory and the tall white lighthouse, and away southward, the sapphire sea, touched with every changing light and shadow. And this lovely little world at George Ransom's feet, this paradise in miniature, was all the lovelier because of the great rugged mountain wall behind it, the bare red and yellow hills baked in the sunlight of ages, the strange old world villages yonder high up on the stony flanks of the hills, the far-away church towers, from which faint sound of bells came now and again as if from fairyland. It was a delicious spot, this little village of St. Jean, to which the Niçois came on Sundays and holidays to eat bouillabaisse at the rustic tavern, or to picnic in the shade of century-old olives and old carouba trees, which made dark masses of foliage between the road and the sea. George Ransom loved the place, and could have been happy there if his wife would only have allowed him. But those halcyon days which marked the beginning of their retirement was too soon ended, and clouds lowered again over the horizon, clouds of doubt and discontent. There are women to whom the domestic peace, a calm and rational happiness, is an impossibility, and Vivien was one of these women. From the beginning her suspicious nature had been on the watch for some hidden evil. She had a fixed idea that the fates had marked her for misery, and she would not open her heart to the sunlight of happiness. Was her husband unkind to her? No, he was all kindness. But to her his kindness seemed only a gentlemanlike form of toleration. He had married her out of pity, and it was pity that made him kind. Other women were worshipped. It was her fate to be tolerated by a man she adored. She could never forget her own passionate folly, her own unwomanly forwardness. She had thrown herself into his arms, she who should have waited to be wooed, and should have made herself precious by the difficulty with which she was won. "How can he help holding me cheap?" she asked herself. "I who cost him nothing, not even an hour of doubt. From the hour we first met he must have known that I adored him." Once, when he was rowing her about the bay in the western sunlight, while the fishermen were laying down their lines, or taking up their baskets here and there by the rocks, she asked him suddenly, "What did you think of me, George, the first time you saw me, that night at Signora Vicenzi's party? Come, be candid. You can afford to tell me the truth now. Your fate is sealed. You have nothing to lose or to gain." "Do you think I would tell you less or more than the truth under any circumstances, Viva?" he asked gravely. "Oh, you are horribly exact, I know," she answered with an impatient movement of her slender sloping shoulders, not looking at him, but with her dark dreamy eyes gazing far across the bay towards the distant point where the twin towers of Monaco Cathedral showed faint in the distance. "But perhaps if the truth sounded very rude you might suppress it — out of pity." "I don't think the truth need sound rude." "Well," still more impatiently, "what impression did I make upon you?" "You must consider that there were at least 50 young ladies in Signora Vicenti's salons that evening." "And about 30 old women, and I was lost in the crowd." "Not quite lost. I remember being attracted by a young lady who sat in a window niche apart." "Like Brunswick fated chieftain. Pray go on." "And who seemed a little out of harmony with the rest of the company. Her manner struck me as unpleasantly ironical, but her small face interested me, and I even liked the mass of tousled hair brushed up from her low square forehead." I liked her black velvet gown, without any colour or ornament. It set off the thin white shoulders and long slender throat. Did you think I was rich or poor, somebody or nobody? I thought you were a clever girl, soured by some kind of disappointment." " And you felt sorry for me. Say you felt sorry for me," she cried, her eyes coming back from the distant promontory, and fixing him suddenly, bright, keen, imperious in their eager questioning. " Yes, I confess to feeling very sorry for you." " Did I not know as much ? From the very first you pitied me. Pity, pity. What an intolerable burden it is. I have bent under it all my life." " My dear Viva, what nonsense you talk ! Because I had mistaken ideas about you that first night, when we were strangers." " You were not mistaken. I was soured. I had been disappointed. My thoughts were bitter as gall. I had no patience with other girls who had so many blessings that I had never known. I saw them making light of their advantages, peevish, ill tempered, self indulgent, and I scorned them. Contempt for others was the only comfort of my barren life. And so my vinegar tongue disgusted you, did it not ?"" I was not disgusted concerned and interested, rather. Your conversation was original. I wanted to know more of you." " Did you think me pretty ?"" I was more impressed by your mental gifts than your physical." " That is only a polite way of saying you thought me plain." " Viva, you know better than that. If I thought of your appearance at all during that first evening, be assured I thought you interesting, yes, and pretty. Only prettiness is a poor word to express a face that is full of intellect and originality." " You thought me pale, faded, haggard, old for my age," she said decisively. " Don't deny it. You must have seen what my glass had been telling me for the last year." " I thought your face showed traces of suffering." This was one of many such conversations, full of keen questioning on her part, with an assumed lightness of manner which thinly veiled the irritability of her mind. She had changed for the worse since they left Nice. She had grown more sensitive, more suspicious, more irritable. She was in a condition of health in which many women are despondent or irritable, in which with some women life seems one long disgust, and all things are irksome, even the things that have been pleasantest and most valued before ; even the aspect of a lovely landscape, the phrases of a familiar melody, the perfume of a once favourite flower. He tried to cheer her by talking of their future, the time to come when there would be a new bond between them, a new interest in their lives ; but she saw all things in a gloomy atmosphere. " Who knows ?" she said. " I may die, perhaps ; or you may love your child better than you have ever loved me, and then I should hate it." " Viva, you cannot doubt that my love for our child will strengthen my love for you." " Will it ?" she asked incredulously. " God knows it needs strengthening." This was hard upon a man whose tenderness and indulgence had been boundless, who had done all that chivalry and a sense of duty can do to atone for the lack of love. He had tried his uttermost to conceal the one bitter truth that love was wanting ; but those keen eyes of hers had seen the gap between them, that sensitive ear had discovered the rift in the lute. One afternoon they climbed the hill to the breezy common on which the lighthouse stands, and dawdled about in the sunshine, gathering the pale gray rosemary bloom and the perfumed thyme which grow among those hollows and hillocks in such wild luxuriance. They were sauntering near the carriage road, talking very little ; she, feeble and tired, although it was her own fancy to have walked so far, when they saw a carriage driving towards them a large landau, with the usual bony horses and shabby jingling harness, and the usual sunburnt good tempered driver. Two girls in white gowns and leghorn hats were in the carriage, with an elderly woman in black. Their laps were full of wild flowers, and branches of wild cherry and pear blossom filled the leather hood at the back of the carriage. They were talking and laughing gaily, all animation and high spirits, as they drew near ; and at sight of George Ransome one of them waved her hand in greeting, and called to the driver to stop. They were two handsome Irish girls who had made a sensation at the Battle of Flowers 6 weeks before. They were spoken of by some people as the belles of Nice. Mr. Ransome had pelted them with Parma violets and yellow rosebuds on the Promenade des Anglais, as they drove up and down in a victoria embowered with white stocks and narcissi. He had waltzed with them at the Cercle de la Mediterranee and the Palais Montano ; had admired them frankly and openly, not afraid to own even to a jealous wife that he thought them beautiful. Delia Darcy, the elder and handsomer of the two, leaned over the carriage door to shake hands with him, while Vivien stood aloof, on a grassy knoll above the road, looking daggers. What right had they to stop their carriage and waylay her husband? " Who would have thought of finding you in this out of the way spot ?" exclaimed Miss Darcy. " We fancied you had left the Riviera. Are you stopping at Monte Carlo ?"" No, I have taken a villa at St. Jean." " Is that near here ?"" Very near. You must have skirted the village in driving up here. And has Nice been very gay since we left ?"" No. People have been going away, and we have missed you dreadfully at the opera, and at dances, and at Rumpelmeyer's. What could have induced you to bury yourself alive in a village ?" she asked vivaciously, with that sparkling manner which gives an air of flirtation to the most commonplace talk. " My wife has been out of health, and it has suited us both to live quietly." " Poor Mrs. Ransome 1 Poor you 1 " exclaimed Miss Darcy, with a sigh. " O, there she is. How do you do, Mrs. Ransome ?" gesticulating with a pretty little hand in a long wrinkled tan glove. " Do come and talk to us." Mrs. Ransome bowed stiffly, but did not move an inch. She stood picking a branch of rosemary to shreds with nervous restless fingers, scattering the poor pale blue gray blossoms as if she were sprinkling them upon a corpse. The two girls took no further notice of her, but both bent forward, talking to Ransome, rattling on about this ball and the other ball, and a breakfast, and sundry afternoon teas, and the goings on audacious, for the most part, of all the smart people at Nice. They had worlds to tell him, having taken it into their heads that he was a humorist, a cynic, who delighted in hearing of the follies of his fellow man. He stood, with his hat off, waiting for the carriage to drive on, inwardly impatient of delay, knowing with what jealous feelings Vivien had always regarded Delia Darcy, dreading a fit of ill temper when the Irish girl should have vanished by and by below the sandy edge of the common. He listened almost in silence, giving their loquacity no more encouragement than good manners obliged. " Why don't you come to the next dance at the Cercle de la Mediterranee ?" said Delia, coaxingly. " There are so few good dancers left, and your step is just the one that suits me best. There are to be amateur theatricals to begin with, scenes from Machado, and I am to be Beatrice. Won't that tempt you ?" she asked, with the insolence of an acknowledged beauty, spoiled by the laxer manners of a foreign settlement, lolling back in the carriage, and smiling at him with brilliant Irish gray eyes, under the shadow of her Leghorn hat, with a great cluster of daffodils just above her forehead, the yellow bloom showing vividly against her dark hair. The other sister was only a paler reflection of this one, and echoed her speeches, laughing when she laughed. " Surely you will come to see Delia act Beatrice," she said. " I can't tell you how well she does it. Sir Randall Spofforth is the Benedict." " My dears, we shall have no time to dress for dinner," expostulated the duenna, feeling that this kind of thing had lasted long enough. " En avant, cocher." " Won't you come ?" pleaded the pertinacious Delia. " It is on the 29th, remember, next Thursday week." The carriage rolled slowly onward. " I regret that I shall not be there," said Ransome decisively. Delia shook her parasol at him in pretended anger. He rejoined his wife. She stood surrounded by the shreds of rosemary and thyme which she had plucked and scattered while he was talking. She was very pale, and he knew only too well that she was very angry. " Come, Viva, it is time we turned homeward," he said. " Yes, the sun has gone down, has it not ?" she exclaimed mockingly, as she looked after the carriage, which sank below the ragged edge of heather and thyme yonder, as if it had dropped over the cliff. " Why, my love, the sun is above our heads." " Is it ? Your sun has gone down, anyhow. She is very lovely, is she not ?" The question was asked with sudden eagerness, as if her life depended upon the reply. She was walking quickly in her agitation, going down the hill much faster than she had mounted it. " Yes, they are both handsome girls, feather headed, but remarkably handsome," her husband answered carelessly. " But Delia is the lovelier. She is your divinity." " Yes, she is the lovelier. The other seems a copy by an inferior hand." " And she is so fond of you. It was cruel to refuse her request, when she pleaded so hard." " How can you be so foolish or so petty, Vivien ? Is it impossible for me to talk for 5 minutes with a handsome girl without unreasonable anger on your part ?"" Do you expect me to be pleased or happy when I see your admiration of another woman admiration you do not even take the trouble to conceal ? Do you suppose I can ever forget last winter how I have seen you dancing with that girl night after night ? Yes, I have had to sit and watch you. I was not popular, I had few partners. And it is bad form to dance more than once with one's husband. I have seen her in your arms, with her head almost lying on your shoulder, again and again, as if it were her natural place. What a handsome couple, I have heard people say. Are they engaged? Do you think that was pleasant for me? You had but to say one word, and I would have left off dancing for ever. Another sacrifice, like your marriage. Vivien, you would provoke a saint. Yes, it is provoking to be chained to one woman when you are dying for another. How much oftener am I to swear to you that I don't care a straw for Miss Darcy? Never again, she answered. I love you too well to wish you to swear a lie. They had come down from the common by this time, and were now upon a pathway nearer home, a narrow footpath on the edge of the cliff opposite Beaulieu. The gently curving bay below them, and behind and above them orchards and gardens, hill and lighthouse. It was one of their chosen walks. They had paced the narrow path many an afternoon when the twin towers of Monaco showed dark in the shadow of sundown. Vivien, I think you are the most difficult creature to live with that ever a man had for his wife," said Ransome, stung to the quick by her persistent perversity. "I am difficult to live with, am I?" she cried. "Why don't you go a step further? Why don't you say at once that you wish I were dead?" she cried, with a wild burst of passion. "Say that you wish me dead." "I own that when you torment me as you are doing to-day, I have sometimes thought of death yours or mine, as the only escape from mutual misery," he answered gloomily. He had been sauntering a few paces in front of her along the narrow path between the olive garden and the edge of the cliff, she following slowly, both in a desultory way, and talking to each other without seeing each other's face. The cliff sank sheer below the pathway, with only a narrow margin of rushy grass between the footpath and the brink of the precipice. It was no stupendous depth, no giddy height from which the eye glanced downward, sickening at the horror of the gulf. One looked down at the jewel bright waves and the many-hued rocks, the fir trees growing out of the crags, without a thought of danger; and yet a false step upon those sunburnt rushes might mean instant death. He came to a sudden standstill after that last speech, and stood leaning with both hands upon his stick, angry, full of gloom, feeling that he had said a cruel thing, yet not repenting of his cruelty. He stood there expectant of her angry answer, but there was only silence. Silence, and then a swift rushing sound, like the flight of a great bird. He looked round, and saw that he was alone. CHAPTER III. Darkness. She had flung herself over the cliff. That rustling noise was the sound of her gown as it brushed against the rushes and seedling firs that clothed the precipice with verdure. He looked over the cliff, and saw her lying among the rocks, a white motionless figure, mangled and crushed, dumb and dead, his victim and his accuser. His first impulse was to fling himself over the edge where she had cast away her life a minute ago. But common sense overcame that movement of despair. A few yards further towards the point the side of the cliff was less precipitous. There were jutting ledges of rock and straggling bushes by which a good climber might let himself down to the beach, not without hazard, but with a fair chance of safety. As he scrambled downward he saw a fisherman's boat shooting across the bay, and he thought that his wife's fall had been seen from the narrow strip of sandy shore yonder towards Beaulieu. She was lying on her side among the low wet slabs of rock, the blue water lapping round her. There was blood upon her face, and on one mangled arm, from which the muslin sleeve was ripped. Her gown had caught in the bushes and was torn to shreds, and the water flowing so gently in and out among her loosened hair was tinged with blood. Her eyes were wide open, staring wildly, and they had a glassy look already. He knew that she was dead. "Did you see her fall?" he asked the men in the boat as they came near. "No," said one. "I heard the gulls scream, and I knew there was something, and then I looked about and saw something white lying there under the cliff." They lifted her gently into the boat and laid her on a folded sail at the bottom, as gently and as tenderly as if she were still capable of feeling, as if she were not past cure. George Ransome asked no question, invited no opinion. He sat in the stern of the boat, dumb and quiet. The horror of this sudden doom had paralyzed him. What had he done that this thing should happen, this wild revenge of a woman's passionate heart which made him a murderer? What had he done? Had he not been patient and forbearing, indulgent beyond the common indulgence of husbands to fretful wives? Had he not blunted the edge of wrath with soft answers? Had he not been affectionate and considerate even when love was dead? And yet, because of one hard speech wrung from his irritated nerves, this wild creature had slain herself. The two fishermen looked at him curiously. He saw the dark southern eyes watching him, saw gravity and restraint upon those fine olive faces which had been wont to beam with friendly smiles. He knew that they suspected evil, but he was in no mood to undeceive them. He sat in an apathetic silence, motionless, stupefied almost, while the men rowed slowly round the point in the golden light of sundown. He scarcely looked at that white still figure lying at the bottom of the boat, the face hidden under a scarlet kerchief which one of the men had taken from his neck. He sat staring at the rocky shore, the white gleaming lighthouse, the long ridge of heathy ground on the crest of the hill, the villas, the gardens with their glow of light and colour, the dark masses of foliage clustering here and there amidst the bright hued rocks. He looked at everything except his dead wife, lying almost at his feet. There was an inquiry that evening before the Juge d'Instruction at Villefranche, and he was made to give an account of his wife's death. He proved a very bad witness. The minute and seemingly frivolous questions addled his brain. He told the magistrate how he had looked round and found the path empty. But he could not say how his wife had fallen, whether she had flung herself over the edge or had fallen accidentally, whether her foot had slipped unawares, whether she had fallen face forward, or whether she had dropped backwards from the edge of the cliff. " I tell you again that I did not see her fall," he protested impatiently. " Did you usually walk in advance of your wife ?" asked the Frenchman. " It was not very polite to turn your back upon a lady." " I was worried and out of temper." " For what reason ?"" My wife's unhappy jealousy created reasons where there were none. The people who know me know that I was not habitually unkind to her." " Yet you gave her an answer which so maddened her that she flung herself over the cliff in despair." " I fear that it was so," he answered, with the deepest distress depicted in his haggard face. " She was in a nervous and irritable condition. I had always borne that fact in mind until that moment. She stung me past endurance by her groundless jealousies. I had been a true and loyal husband to her from the hour of our marriage. I have never wronged her by so much as a thought, and yet I could not talk to a pretty peasant girl or confess my admiration for any woman I met in society without causing an outbreak of temper that was almost madness. I bore with her long and patiently. I remembered that the circumstances of her childhood and youth had been adverse, that her nature had been warped and perverted. I forgave all faults of temper in a wife who loved me. But this afternoon, almost for the first time since our marriage, I spoke unkindly, cruelly perhaps. I have no wish to avoid interrogation, or to conceal any portion of the truth." " You did not push her over the cliff ?"" I did not. Do I look like a murderer, or bear the character of a man likely to commit murder ?" The examination went on, with cruel reiteration of almost the same questions. The Juge d'Instruction was a hard headed legal machine, who believed that the truth might be wrung out of any criminal by persistent questioning. He suspected Ransome, or deemed it his duty to suspect him, and he ordered him to be arrested on leaving the court. So George Ransome passed the night after his wife's death in the lock up at Villefranche. What a night that was for a man to live through ! He sat on a stone bench, listening to the level plish plash of that tideless sea ever so far beneath him. He heard the footsteps going up and down the steep stony street of that wonderful old seaport. He heard the scream of the gulls and the striking of the clock on the crest of the hill as he sat motionless, with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands, brooding over that swift sudden horror of yesterday. Could it have been an accident ? Did she step backwards unawares and slip over the edge ? No. He remembered where she was standing when he last looked at her, some distance from the side of the cliff, standing among the heather and wild thyme which grew down to the edge of the little path. She must have made a rapid rush to the brink after that fatal speech of his. She had flung her life away in a single impulse of blind, mad anger or despair. She had not paused for an instant to take thought. Alas, he knew her so well. He had so often seen those sudden gusts of passion. the rush of crimson to the pale small face, the quivering lips striving impotently for speech, the fury in the dark eyes, and the small nervous hands clenched convulsively. He had seen her struggle with the demon of anger, and had seen the storm pass swifter than a tempest-driven cloud across the moon. Another moment, and she would burst into tears, fling her arms round his neck, and implore him to forgive her. " I love you too well ever to know happiness," she said. That was her favourite apology. " It is only people without passions who can be happy," she told him once. " I sometimes think that you belong to that family." And she was dead. She, whose undisciplined love had so plagued and tried him, she was dead. And he felt himself her murderer. Alas, doubly a murderer, since she had perished just at that time when her life should have been the most precious to him, when he should have made any sacrifice to secure her peace. He, who had seen all the evils of a fretful temper exhibited in her character, had yet been weak enough to yield to a moment of anger, and to insult the woman whom he ought to have cherished. A long familiar line of Byron's haunted his brain all through the night, and mixed itself with that sound of footsteps on the street of stairs, and the scream of the gulls and the flapping of the waves against the stone quay. She died, but not alone. She who was to have been the mother of his first-born child was lying dead in the white-walled villa where they had once been happy. Hush! In the soft clear light of an April morning he heard the tolling of the church bell, solemn, slow, measured, at agonizing intervals which left an age of expectancy between the heavy strokes of the clapper. Vivos voco mortuos plango. They bury their dead at daybreak in that fair land of orange and lemon groves. In the early morning of the first day after death, the hastily fashioned coffin was carried out into the sunshine, and the funeral procession wound slowly up the hill towards the graveyard near the church of Villefranche. George Ransome knew how brief is the interval between death and burial on that southern shore, and he had little doubt that the bell was tolling for her whose heart was beating passionately when the sun began to sink. So soon! Her grave would be filled in and trodden down before they let him out of prison. It had never seemed to him that he was to stay long in captivity, or that there would be any difficulty in proving his innocence of any part in the catastrophe, except that fatal part of having upset the balance of a weak mind and provoked a passionate woman to suicide. As for the confinement of the past night, he had scarcely thought about it. He had a curious semi-consciousness of time and place which was a new experience to him. He found himself forgetting where he was and what had happened. There were strange gaps in his mind, intervals of oblivion, and then there were periods in which he sat looking at the slanting shaft of sunlight between the window and the ground, and trying to count the motes that danced in that golden haze. The day passed strangely, too, sometimes at railroad pace, sometimes with a ghastly slowness. Then came a night in which sleep never visited his eyelids, a night of bodily and mental restlessness, the greater part of which he spent in futile efforts to open the heavily bolted door, or to drag the window bars from their stone sockets. His prison was a relic of the Middle Ages, and Hercules himself could not have got out of it. In all those endeavours he was actuated by a blind impulse, a feverish desire to be at large again. Not once during that night did he think of his dead wife in her new made grave on the side of the hill. He had forgotten why they had shut him up in that stony chamber, or rather had imagined another reason for his imprisonment. He was a political offender, had been deeply concerned in a plot to overthrow Victor Emmanuel, and to create a republic for Italy. He himself was to be president of that republic. He felt all the power to rule and legislate for a great nation. He compared himself with Solon and with Pericles, to the disadvantage of both. There was a greatness in him which neither of those had ever attained. I should rule them as God himself, he thought. It would be a golden age of truth and justice, a millennium of peace and plenty. And while the nations are waiting for me, I am shut up here by the treachery of France. Next morning he was taken before the Juge d'Instruction for the second time. The two fishermen who picked up his wife's corpse were present as witnesses, also his wife's maid and the 3 other servants, also his wife's doctor. He was again questioned severely, but this time nothing could induce him to give a direct answer to any question. He raved about the Italian Republic, of which he was to be chief. He told the French magistrate that France had conspired with the Italian tyrant to imprison and suppress him. "Every other pretence is a subterfuge," he said. "My popularity in Italy is at the root of this monstrous charge. There will be a rising of the whole nation if you do not instantly release me. For your own sake, sir, I warn you to be prompt." "This man is pretending to be mad," said the magistrate. "I fear there is more reality than pretence about the business," said the doctor. He took Ransome to the window, and looked at his eyes in the strong white light of noon. Then he went over to the magistrate, and they whispered together for some minutes, while the prisoner sat staring at the floor and muttering to himself. After that there came a long dark interval in George Ransome's life. A waking dream of intolerable length, but not unalloyed misery. For the hallucinations which made his madness buoyed him up and sustained him during some part of that dark period. He talked with princes and statesmen. He was not alone in the madhouse chamber, or in the madhouse garden, or in that great iron cage where even the most desperate maniacs were allowed to disport themselves in the air and the sunlight as in a gymnasium. He was surrounded by invisible friends and flatterers, by public functionaries who quailed before his glance and were eager to obey his commands. Sometimes he wrote letters and telegrams all day long upon any scraps of paper which his keepers would give him. Sometimes he passed whole days in a dreamy silence, with arms folded, and abstracted gaze fixed on the distant hill-tops, like Napoleon at St. Helena, brooding over the future of nations. By and by there came a period of improvement, or what was called improvement by the doctors, but which to the patient seemed a time of strange blankness and disappointment. All those busy shadows which had peopled his life, his senators and flatterers, had abandoned him. He was alone in that strange place amidst a strange people, most of whom seemed to be somewhat wrong in their heads. He was able to read the newspapers now, and was vexed to find that his speeches were unreported, his letters and manifestoes unpublished; disappointed to find that Victor Emmanuel was still King of Italy, and the new Republic still a web of dreams. His temper was very fitful at this time, and he had intervals of violence. One morning he found himself upon the hills, digging with half a dozen other men, young and old, dressed pretty much like himself. It was in the early summer morning, before the sun had made the world too hot for labour. It was rapture to him to be there, digging and running about on the dewy hillside, in an amphitheatre of mountains, high above the stony bed of the Paillon. The air was full of sweet odours, orange and lemon bloom, roses and lilies, from the gardens and orchards below. He felt that earth and sky were rapturously lovely, that life was a blessing and a privilege beyond all words. He had not the consciousness of a single care, or even a troubled memory. His quarrel with his father, his self-imposed exile, his marriage and its bitter disillusions, his wife's tragical fate, all were forgotten. He felt as a sylph might feel, a creature without earthly obligations, revelling in the glory of nature. This new phase of being lasted so long as the hills and the sky wore their aspect of novelty. It was succeeded by a period of deepest depression, a melancholy which weighed him down like a leaden burden. He sat in the madhouse garden apart from the rest, brooding over the darkness of life. He had no hopes, no desires. Gradually memory began to return. He asked why his wife did not come to see him. "She used to be so fond of me," he said, "foolishly fond of me, and now she deserts me." Then he talked of going home again. The image of his latest dwelling place had gradually shaped itself in his mind. He saw the hedges of pale amber roses, the carouba trees, dark against the glittering blue of the sea, which shone through every opening in the branches like a background of lapis lazuli, and the rugged mountains rising above the low curving shore, steeply towards the sky, with patches of olive here and there on their stony flanks, but for the most part bare and barren, reddish yellow, steeped in sunlight. Yes, he remembered every feature of that lovely and varied scene. The village of Isa yonder on the mountain road, a cluster of stony dwellings perched upon rocky foundations, hardly to be distinguished from the rough crags upon which they were built, and higher still, in a cleft of those yellow hills, Turbia and its cloven towers, the birthplace of Roman emperors. How lovely it all was, and how pleasant it had been to lounge in his garden, where the light looked dazzling on beds of white gillyflowers, and where the blue summer sea smiled in the far distance, with a faint purple cloud yonder on the horizon which represented Corsica. Why had he ever left that familiar home? Why could he not return to it? " Get me a carriage," he said to one of the attendants. " I want to go home immediately. My wife is waiting for me." It is not customary to make explanations to patients even in the best regulated asylums. Nobody answered him. Nobody explained anything to him. He found himself confronted with a dogged silence. He wore himself out in an agony of impatience, like a bird beating itself to death against its bars. He languished in a miserable ignorance, piecing his past life together, bit by bit, with a strange interweaving of fancies and realities, until by slow degrees the fancies dropped out of the web, and left him face to face with the truth. At last the record of the past was complete. He knew that his wife was dead, and remembered how she had died. He knew that he had been a prisoner, first in jail, and then in a lunatic asylum ; but he did not acknowledge to himself that he had been mad. He remembered the bell tolling in the saffron light of dawn. He remembered the magistrate's exasperating questions. He remembered everything. After this he sank into a state of sullen despair, and silence and apathy were accepted as the indications of cure. He was told by the head physician that he could leave the institution whenever he pleased. There was an account against him as a private patient, which had been guaranteed by his landlord, who knew him to be a man of some means. His German manservant had been to the asylum many times to inquire about him. The doctor recommended him to travel, in Switzerland, until the end of the autumn, and to take his servant as his attendant and courier. " Change of air and scene will be of inestimable advantage to you," said the doctor, " but it would not be wise for you to travel alone." " What month is it ?"" August the 22nd." " And my wife died early in April," he said. " Only a few months, and I feel as if I had been in this place a century." He took the doctor's advice. He cared very little where he went or what became of him. Life and the world, his own individuality and the beautiful earth around and about him were alike indifferent to him. He went back to the villa at St. Jean, and to the garden he loved so well in the bright fresh springtime. All things had an overgrown and neglected look in the ripeness of expiring summer : too many flowers, a rank luxuriance of large leaves and vivid blossoms, fruit rotting in the long grass, an odour of decaying oranges, the waste of the last harvest. He went up to the graveyard on the hill above the harbour. It was not a picturesque burial place. The cemetery at Cimies was far more beautiful. The cemetery at Nice was in a grander position. He felt sorry that she should lie here, amidst the graves of sailors and fishermen, as even if after death she were slighted and hardly used. He was summoned back to England early in the following year to his mother's death bed. Neither she nor any of his family had known the miserable end of his married life. They knew only that he had married, and had lost his wife after a year of marriage. Hazard had not brought any one belonging to him in contact with any of those few people who knew the details of that tragical story. His mother's death made him rich and independent, but until the hour he met Mildred Fausset his life was a blank. End of chapters 2 and 3. Book 3, Chapters 4 and 5 of The Fatal Three by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER IV. The Grave on the Hill. After that visit to the great white barrack on the road to St. Andre, Mildred felt that her business at Nice was finished, that there was nothing more for her to learn. She knew all the sad story now, all except those lights and shadows of the picture which only the unhappy actor in that domestic tragedy could have told her. The mystery of the past had unfolded itself, stage by stage, from that Sunday afternoon when Cesar Castellani came to Enderby Manor, and out of trivial seeming talk launched a thunderbolt. The curtain was lifted. There was no more to be done. And yet Mildred lingered at Nice, loving the place and its environs a little for their own beauty, and feeling a strange and sorrowful interest in the scene of her husband's misfortunes. There was another reason for remaining in the gay white city in the fact that Lady Lochinvar had taken a fancy to Miss Ransome, and that the young lady seemed to be achieving a remarkably rapid cure of her infatuation for the Italian. It may have been because at the Palais Montano she met a good many Italians, and that the charm of that nationality became less potent with familiarity. There was music, too, at the Palais, and to spare, according to Mr. Stuart, who was not an enthusiast and was wont to shirk his aunt's musical reunions. Mildred was delighted to see her husband's niece entering society under such agreeable auspices. She went out with her occasionally, just enough to make people understand that she was not indifferent to her niece's happiness ; and for the rest, Lady Lochinvar and Mrs. Murray were always ready to chaperon the frank, bright girl, who was much admired by the best people, and was never at a loss for partners at dances, whoever else might play wallflower. Mrs. Greswold invited Mr. and Mrs. Murray and Malcolm Stuart to a quiet little dinner at the Westminster, and the impression the young man made upon Mildred's mind was altogether favourable. He was certainly not handsome, but his plainness was of an honest Scottish type, and his freckled complexion and blue eyes, sandy hair and moustache, were altogether different from the traditionary Judas colouring of Castellani's auburn beard and hazel eyes. Truth and honesty beamed in the Scotchman's open countenance. He looked every inch a soldier and a gentleman. That he admired Pamela was obvious to the most unobservant eye. That she affected to look down upon him was equally obvious ; but it might be that her good humoured scorn of him was more pretence than reality. She made light of him openly as one of that inferior race of men whose minds never soar above the stable, the gun room, or the home farm, and whose utmost intellectual ingenuity culminates in the invention of a salmon fly or the discovery of a new fertilizer for turnip fields. " You are just like my brother in law, Henry Mountford," she told him. " From the air with which you say that, I conclude Sir Henry Mountford must be a very inferior person." " Not at all. He is the kind of man whom all other men seem to respect. I believe he is one of the best shots in England. His bags are written about in the newspapers ; and I wonder there are any pigeons left in the world, considering the way he has slaughtered them. I saw him shoot at Monte Carlo the year before last." " Yes, he went there and back in a week on purpose to shoot. Imagine any man coming to this divine Riviera, this land of lemon groves and palms, and roses and violets, just to slaughter pigeons. He won the Grand Prix. It was a pretty big feather in his cap," said Mr. Stuart. " Am I to conclude that you dislike sportsmen ?"" I prefer men who cultivate their minds." " Ah, but a man who shoots well and rides straight, and can play a big salmon, and knows how to manage a farm cannot be altogether an imbecile. I never knew a really fine rider yet who was a fool. Good horsemanship needs so many qualities that fools don't possess ; and to be a crack shot, I assure you that a man must have some brains and a good deal of perseverance ; and perseverance is not a bad thing in its way, Miss Ransome." He looked at her with a certain significance in his frank blue eyes, looked at her resolutely, as some bold young Vandal or Visigoth might have looked at a Roman maiden whom he meant to subjugate. " I did not say that sportsmen were fools," she answered sharply. " I only say that the kind of man I respect is the man whose pleasures are those of the intellect, who is in the front rank among the thinkers of his age, who reads Darwin and the German metaphysicians, I suppose. I tried Darwin to see if he would help me in my farming, but I can't say I got very much out of him in that line. There's more in old Virgil for an agriculturist. I'm not a reading man, you see, Miss Ransome. I find by the time I've read the daily paper my thirst for knowledge is pretty well satisfied. There's such a lot of information in the London papers, and when you add the Figaro and the New York Herald, there's not much left for a man to learn. I generally read the quarterlies, as a duty, to discover how many dull books have enriched the world during the previous 3 months." " That's a great deal more reading than my brother in law gets through. He makes a great fuss about his Times every morning ; but I believe he seldom goes beyond the births, marriages, and deaths, or a report of a billiard match. He reads The Field as a kind of religion, and Bailey's Magazine, and I think that's all." " Do you like men who write books, Miss Ransome, as well as men who read them ?" Pamela crimsoned to the roots of her hair at this most innocent question. Malcolm Stuart marked that blush with much perplexity. " When one is interested in a book one likes to know the author," she replied with cautious vagueness. " Do you know many writers ?"" Not many. In fact, only one." " Who is he ?"" Mr. Castellani, the author of Nepenthe." " Nepenthe ? Ah, that's a novel people were talking about some time ago. My aunt was full of it, because she fancied it embodied some of her own ideas. She wanted me to read it. I tried a few chapters," said Malcolm, making a wry face. " Sickly stuff." People who are not in the habit of reading the literature of imagination can hardly understand such a book as Nepenthe," replied Pamela severely. " They are out of touch with the spirit of the book." " One has to be trained up to that kind of thing, I suppose. One must forget that two and two make four, in order to get into the proper frame of mind, eh ? Is the author of Nepenthe an interesting man ?" He was shrewd enough to interpret the blush aright. The author of Nepenthe was a person to be dreaded by any aspirant to Miss Ransome's favour. " He is like his book," answered Pamela briefly. " Is he a young man ?"" I don't know your idea of youth. He is older than my aunt about 35. Stuart was just 30 one point in his favour anyhow, he told himself, not knowing that to a romantic girl years may be interesting. " Handsome ?"" That is always a matter of opinion. He is just the kind of man who ought to have written Nepenthe. That is really all I can tell you," said Pamela with some irritation. " I believe Lady Lochinvar knew Mr. Castellani when he was a very young man. She can satisfy your curiosity about him." " I am not curious. Castellani ! An Italian, I suppose one of my aunt's innumerable geniuses. She has a genius for discovering geniuses. When I see her with a new one I am always reminded of a child with a little coloured balloon. So pretty till it bursts." Pamela turned her back upon him in a rage, and went over to the piano to talk to Mrs. Murray, who was preparing to sing one of her repertoire of 5 Scotch ballads. " Shall it be Gin a Body or Hunting Tower ?" she asked meekly ; and nobody volunteering a decisive opinion, she chirruped the former coquettish little ballad, and put a stop to social intercourse for exactly 4 minutes and a half. After that evening Mr. Stuart knew who his rival was, and with what kind of influence he had to contend. An author, a musical man, a genius. Well, he had very few weapons with which to fight such an antagonist, he who was neither musical nor literary, nor gifted with any of the graces which recommend a lover to a sentimental girl. But he was a man, and he meant to win her. He admired her for her frank young prettiness, so unsophisticated and girlish, and for that perfect truthfulness of mind which made all her thoughts transparent. He was too much a man of the world to ignore the fact that Miss Ransome of Mapledown would be a very good match for him, or that such a marriage would strengthen his position in his aunt's esteem. Women bow down to success. Encouraged by these considerations, Mr. Stuart pursued the even tenor of his way, and was not disheartened by the idea of the author of Nepenthe, more especially as that attractive personage was not on the ground. He had one accomplishment over and above the usual outdoor exercises of a country gentleman. He could dance ; and he was Pamela's favourite partner wherever she went. No one else waltzed as well. Not even the most gifted of her German acquaintance. Not even the noble Spaniards who were presented to her. He had another and still greater advantage in the fact that he was often in the young lady's society. She was fond of Lady Lochinvar, and spent a good deal of her life at the Palais Montano, where, with Mrs. Murray's indefatigable assistance, there were tennis parties twice a week. That charming garden, with its numerous summer houses, made a kind of club for the privileged few who were permitted les petites entrees. While Pamela was enjoying the spring time amongst people whose only thought was of making the best of life, and getting the maximum of sunshine, Mildred Greswold spent her days in sad musings upon an irrevocable past. It was her melancholy pleasure to revisit again and again the place in which her husband had lived, the picturesque little village under the shadow of the tall cliff, every pathway which he must have trodden, every point from which he must have gazed across the bay, seaward or landward, in his troubled reveries. She dwelt with morbid persistence on the thought of those two lives, both dear to her, yet in their union how terrible a curse. She revisited the villa until the old caretaker grew to look upon her as a heaven sent benefactress, and until the village children christened her the English Madonna, that pensive look recalling the face of the statue in a church yonder, so mildly sad, a look of ineffable sweetness tinged with pain. She sat for hours at a stretch in the sunlit garden, amongst such flowers as must have been blooming there in those closing hours of Fay's wedded life, when the shadow of her cruel fate was darkening round her, though she knew it not. She talked to people who had known the English lady. Alas, they were all dubious in their opinions. None would answer boldly for the husband's innocence. They shrugged their shoulders, they shook their heads. Who could say ? Only the good God would ever know the truth about that story. The place to which she went oftenest in those balmy afternoons was the burial ground on the hill, where Fay's grave, with its white marble cross, occupied one of the highest points in the enclosure, and stood out sharp and clear against the cloudless sapphire. The inscription on that marble was of the briefest: Vivian Ransom, died April 24th, 1868. Eternally lamented. Below the cross stretched the grass mound, without shrub or flower. It was Mildred's task to beautify this neglected grave. She brought a florist from the neighbourhood to carry out her own idea, and on her instruction he removed the long rank grass from the mound, and planted a cross of roses, 8 feet long, dwarf bush roses, closely planted, Gloire de Dijon and Marechal Niel. She remembered how Fay had revelled in the rose garden at The Hook, where midsummer was a kind of carnival of roses. Here the roses would bloom all the year round, and there would be perpetual perfume and blossom and colour above poor Fay's cold dust. CHAPTER V. Pamela changes her mind. Lucifer himself, after his fall, could not have felt worse than Cesar Castellani when he followed Mildred Greswold to Nice, as he did within a week after she left Pallanza. He went to Nice partly because he was an idle man, and had no desire to go back to English east winds just when the glory of the southern springtide was beginning. He was tolerably well furnished with money, and Nice was as good to him as any other place, while the neighbourhood of Monte Carlo was always an attraction. He followed in Mildred's footsteps, therefore, but he had no idea of forcing himself upon her presence for some time to come. He knew that his chances were ruined in that quarter for the time being, if not for ever. This was his first signal overthrow. Easy conquests had so demoralized him that he had grown to consider all conquests easy. He had unlimited faith in the charm of his own personality, his magnetic power, as he called it, and behold, his magnetic power had failed utterly with this lovely, lonely woman, who should have turned to him in her desolation as the flowers turn to the sun. For once in his life he had overrated himself and his influence, and in so doing he had lost the chance of a very respectable alliance. 1,500 a year would be at least bread and cheese, he reflected, and to marry an English heiress of a good old family would solidify my position in society. The girl is pretty enough, and I could twist her round my finger. She would bore me frightfully. But every man must suffer something. There is always a discord somewhere amidst the harmony of life, and if one's teeth are not too often set on edge by that false note, one should be content. He remembered how contemptuously he had rejected the idea of such a marriage in his talk with Miss Fausset, and how she had been set upon it. I should stand ever so much better with her if I married well, and solidified myself into British respectability. I might naturalize myself, and go into Parliament, perhaps, if that would please the good soul at Brighton. What will she leave me when she dies, I wonder? She is muter than the Sphinx upon that point. And will she ever die? Brighton is famous for pauper females of 90 and upwards. A woman like Miss Fausset, who lives in cotton wool and has long done with the cares and passions of life, might go well into a second century. I don't see any brilliancy in the prospect there. But so long as I please her and do well in the world she will no doubt be generous. He told himself that it was essential he should make some concession to Miss Fausset's prejudices now that he had failed with Mildred. So long as he had hoped to win that nobler prize he had been careless how he jeopardized the favour of his elderly patroness. But now he felt that her favour was all in all to him, and that the time for trifling was past. She had been very generous to him during the years that had gone by since she first came to his aid almost unasked, and helped him to pay his college debts. She had come to the rescue many times since that juvenile entanglement, and her patience had been great. Yet she had not failed to remonstrate with him at every fresh instance of folly and self-indulgent extravagance. She had talked to him with an unflinching directness. She had refused further help. But somehow she had always given way, and the cheque had been written. Again and again she had warned him that there were limits even to her forbearance. " If I saw you working earnestly and industriously, I should not mind, even if you were a failure," said his benefactress severely. " I have worked, and I have produced a book which was not a failure," replied Cesar with his silkiest air. " One book in a decade of so called literary life. Did the success of that book result in the payment of one single debt ?"" Dearest lady, would you have a man waste his own earnings, the first fruits of his pen, the grains of fairy gold that filtered through the mystic web of his fancy? Would you have him fritter away that sacred product upon importunate hosiers or vindictive bootmakers? That money was altogether precious to me. I kept it in my waistcoat pocket as long as ever I could. The very touch of the coin thrilled me. I believe cabmen and crossing sweepers had most of it in the long run," he concluded, with a remorseful sigh. Miss Fausset had borne with his idleness and his vanity as indulgent mothers bear with their sons ; but he felt that she was beginning to tire of him. There were reasons why she should always continue forbearing, but he wanted to insure himself something better than reluctant subsidies. These considerations being taken into account, Mr. Castellani was fain to own to himself that he had been a fool in rejecting the substance for the shadow, however alluring the lovely shade might be. " But I loved her," he sighed. " I loved her as I had never loved until I saw her fair Madonna face amidst the century old peace of her home. She filled my life with a new element ; she purified and exalted my whole being. And she is thrice as rich as that prattling girl." He ground his teeth at the remembrance of his failure. There had been no room for doubt. Those soft violet eyes had been transformed by indignation, and had flashed upon him with angry fire. That fair Madonna face had whitened to marble with suppressed passion. Not by one glance, not by one tremor in the contemptuous voice, had the woman he loved acknowledged his influence. He put up at the Cosmopolitan, got in half a dozen French novels of the most advanced school from Calignani's library, and kept himself very close for a week or two ; but he contrived to find out what the ladies at the Westminster were doing through Albrecht the courier, who believed him to be Miss Ransome's suitor, and was inclined to be communicative, after being copiously treated to bocks or petit verre, as the case might be. From Albrecht Castellani heard how Miss Ransome spent most of her time at the Palais Montano, or gadding about with her ladyship and Mrs. Murray ; how, in Albrecht's private opinion, the balls and other dissipations of Nice were turning that young lady's head ; how Mrs. Greswold went for lonely drives day after day, and would not allow Albrecht to show her the beauties of the neighbourhood, which it would have been alike his duty and pleasure to have done. He had ascertained that her favourite and indeed habitual drive was to St. Jean, where she was in the habit of leaving the fly at the little inn where she strolled about the village in a purposeless manner. All this appeared to Albrecht as eccentric and absurd, and beneath a lady of Mrs. Greswold's position. She would have employed her time to more advantage in going on distant excursions in a carriage and pair, and in lunching at remote hotels, where Albrecht would have been sure of a bonne main from a gratified landlord, as well as his commission from the livery stable. Castellani heard with displeasure of Pamela's dancings and junketings, and he told himself that it was time to throw himself across her pathway. He had not been prepared to find that she could enjoy life without him. Her admiration of him had been so transparent, her sentimental fancy so naively revealed, that he had believed himself the sultan of her heart, having only to throw the handkerchief whenever it might suit him to claim his prey. Much as he prided himself upon his knowledge of human nature, as exemplified in the softer sex, he had never estimated the fickleness of a shallow sentimental character like Pamela's. No man with a due regard to the value and dignity of his sex would conceive the ruthless rapidity with which a young lady of this temperament will transfer her affections and her large assortment of day dreams and romantic fancies from one man to another. No man could conceive her capacity for admiring in number two all those qualities which were lacking in number one. No man could imagine the exquisite adaptability of girlhood to surrounding circumstances. Had Castellani taken Miss Ransome when she was in the humour, he would have found her the most amiable and yielding of wives : a model English wife, ready to adapt herself in all things to the will and the pleasure of her husband ; unselfish, devoted, unassailable in her belief in her husband as the first and best of men. But he had not seized his opportunity. He had allowed nearly a month to go by since his defeat at Pallanza, and he had allowed Pamela to discover that life might be endurable, nay, even pleasant, without him. And now, hearing that the young lady was gadding about, and divining that such gadding was the high road to forgetfulness, Mr. Castellani made up his mind to resume his sway over Miss Ransome's fancy without loss of time. He called upon a dashing American matron whom he had visited in London and Paris, and who was now the occupant of a villa on the Promenade des Anglais, and in her drawing room he fell in with several of his London acquaintances. He found, however, that his American friend, Mrs. Montague W. Brown, had not yet succeeded in being invited to the Palais Montano, and only knew Lady Lochinvar and Miss Ransome by sight. " Her ladyship is too stand offish for my taste," said Mrs. Montague Brown ;" but the girl seems friendly enough. No style, not as we Americans understand style. I am told she ranks as an heiress on this side, but at the last ball at the Cercle she wore a frock that I should call dear at $40. That young steward is after her, evidently. I hope you are going to the dance next Tuesday, Mr. Castellani. I want some one nice to talk to now my waltzing days are over." Castellani protested that Mrs. Montague Brown was in the very heyday of a dancer's age, and would be guilty of gross cruelty to terpsichorean society in abandoning that delightful art. " You make me tired," said Mrs. Montague Brown, with perfect good humour. " There are plenty of women who don't know when they're old, but I calculate every woman knows when she weighs 160 pounds. When my waist came to 26 inches I knew it was time to leave off waltzing ; and I was pretty good at it, too, in my day, I can tell you." " With that carriage you must have been divine," replied Cesar ;" and I believe the cestus of the Venus de Milo must measure over 26 inches." " The Venus de Milo has no more figure than the peasant women one sees on the promenade, women who seem as if they set their faces against the very idea of a waist. Be sure you get a card for Tuesday. I hate a dude, but I love to have some smart men about me wherever I go." " I shall be there," said Castellani, bending over his hostess and imparting a confidential pressure to her fat white hand, by way of leave taking, before he slipped silently from the room. He had studied the art of departure as if it were a science ; never lingered, never hummed and hawed, never said he must go and didn't ; never apologised for going so soon while everybody was pining to get rid of him. The next day there was a battle of flowers ; not the great floral fete before the Sugarplum Carnival, but an altogether secondary affair, pleasant enough in the balmy weather of advancing spring. Every one of any importance was on the promenade, and among the best carriages appeared Lady Lochinvar's barouche, decorated with white camellias and carmine carnations. She had carefully eschewed that favourite mixture of camellias and Parma violets, which has always a half mourning or funereal air. Malcolm Stuart and Miss Ransome sat side by side on the front seat, with a great basket of carnations on their knees, with which they pelted their acquaintance, while Lady Lochinvar, in brown velvet and ostrich plumage, reposed at her ease in the back of the spacious carriage, and enjoyed the fun without any active participation. It was Pamela's first experience in flower fights, and to her the scene seemed enchanting. The afternoon was peerless. She wore a white gown, as if it had been midsummer, and white gowns were the rule in most of the carriages. The sea was at its bluest, the pink walls and green shutters, white walls and red roofs, the orange trees, cactus, and palm, made up a picture of a city in fairyland, taken as a background to a triple procession of carriages all smothered in Parma violets, Dijon roses, camellias, and narcissus, with here and there some picturesque coach festooned with oranges and lemons amidst tropical foliage. The carriages moved at a foot pace. The pavements were crowded with smart people, who joined in the contest. Pamela's lap was full of bouquets, which fell from her in showers as she stood up every now and then to fling a handful of carnations into a passing carriage. Presently, while she was standing thus, flushed and sparkling, she saw a familiar figure on the footpath by the sea, and paled suddenly at the sight. It was Cesar Castellani, sauntering slowly along in a short coat of light coloured cloth, and a felt hat of exactly the same delicate shade. He came to the carriage door. There was a block at the moment, and he had time to talk to the occupants. " How do you do, Lady Lochinvar ? You have not forgotten me, I hope, Cesar Castellani, though it is such ages since we met." He only lifted his hat to Lady Lochinvar, waiting for her recognition, but he held out his hand to Pamela. " How do you like Nice, Miss Ransome ? As well as Pallanza, I hope." " Ever so much better than Pallanza." There was a time when that coat and hat, the soupcon of dark blue velvet waistcoat just showing underneath the pale buff collar, the loose China silk handkerchief carelessly fastened with a priceless intaglio, the gardenia and pearl gray gloves, would have ensnared Pamela's fancy ; but that time was past. She thought that Cesar's costume looked effeminate and underbred beside the stern simplicity of Mr. Stuart's heather mixture complet. The scales had fallen from her eyes, and she recognised the bad taste and the vanity involved in that studied carelessness, that artistic combination of colour. She remembered what Mildred had said of Mr. Castellani, and she was deliberately cold. Lady Lochinvar was gracious, knowing nothing to the Italian's discredit. " I remember you perfectly," she said. " You have changed very little in all these years. Be sure you come and see me. I am at home at 5 almost every afternoon." The carriage moved on, and Pamela sat in an idle reverie for the next 10 minutes, although the basket of carnations was only half empty. She was thinking how strange it was that her heart beat no faster. Could it be that she was cured and so soon ? It was even worse than a cure. It was a positive revulsion of feeling. She was vexed with herself for ever having exalted that overdressed foreigner into a hero. She felt she had been un English, unwomanly even, in her exaggerated admiration of an exotic. And then she glanced at Malcolm Stuart, and averted her eyes with a conscious blush on seeing him earnestly observant of her. He was plain, certainly. His features had been moulded roughly, but they were not bad features. The lines were rather good, in fact, and it was a fine manly countenance. He was fair and slightly freckled, as became a Scotchman. His eyes were clear and blue, but could be compared to neither sapphires nor violets, and his eyelashes were lighter than any cultivated young lady could approve. The general tone of his hair and complexion was ginger ; and ginger, taken in connection with masculine beauty, is not all one would wish. But then ginger is not uncommon in the service, and it is a hue which harmonises agreeably with Highland bonnets and tartan. No doubt Mr. Stuart had looked really nice in his uniform. He had certainly appeared to advantage in a Highland costume at the fancy ball the other night. Some people had pronounced him the finest looking man in the room. And again, good looks are of little importance in a man. A plainish man, possessed of all the manly accomplishments, a dead shot and a crack rider, can always appear to advantage in English society. Pamela was beginning to think more kindly of sportsmen, and even of Sir Henry Mountford. " I'm sure Mr. Stuart would get on with him," she thought, dimly foreseeing a day when Sir Henry and her new acquaintance would be brought together somehow. Cesar Castellani took immediate advantage of Lady Lochinvar's invitation. He presented himself at the Palais Montano on the following afternoon, and he found Pamela established there as if she belonged to the house. It was she who poured out the tea and dispensed those airy little hot cakes, which were a kind of idealized galette, served in the daintiest of doilies, embroidered with Lady Lochinvar's cipher and coronet. Mr. and Mrs. Murray were there, and Malcolm Stuart, the chief charm of whose society seemed to consist in his exhibition of an accomplished dandydinment which usurped the conversation, and which Castellani would have liked to inoculate then and there with the most virulent form of rabies. Pamela squatted on a little stool at the creature's feet, and assisted in showing him off. She had acquired a power over him which indicated an acquaintance of some standing. " What fools girls are !" thought Castellani. His conquests among women of maturer years had been built upon rock, as compared with the shifting quicksand of a girl's fancy. He began to think the genus girl utterly contemptible. " He has but one fault," said Pamela, when the terrier had gone through various clumsy evolutions in which the bandiness of his legs and the length of his body had been shown off to the uttermost. " He cannot endure Box, and Box detests him. They never meet without trying to murder each other, and I'm very much afraid," bending down to kiss the broad airy head, " that Dandy is the stronger." " Of course he is. Box is splendid for muscle, but weight must tell in the long run," replied Mr. Stuart. " My grandmother had a Dandy whose father belonged to Sir Walter Scott," began Mrs. Murray. " He was simply a perfect dog, and my mamma " Castellani fled from this inanity. He went to the other end of the room, where Lady Lochinvar was listening listlessly to Mr. Murray, laid himself out to amuse her ladyship for the next 10 minutes, and then departed without so much as a look at Pamela. " The spell is broken," he said to himself as he drove away. " The girl is next door to an idiot. No doubt she will marry that sandy Scotchman. Lady Lochinvar means it, and a silly pated miss like that can be led with a thread of floss silk. Moi je m'en fiche." About a week after Mr. Castellani's reappearance, Mildred Greswold received a letter from Brighton, which made a sudden change in her plans. It was from Mr. Maltravers, the incumbent of St. Edmund's. St. Edmund's Vicarage. Dear Mrs. Greswold, after our thoroughly confidential conversations last autumn, I feel justified in addressing you upon a subject which I know is very near to your heart, namely the health and welfare, spiritual as well as bodily, of your dear aunt and my most valued parishioner, Miss Fausset. The condition of that dear lady has given me considerable uneasiness during the last few months. She has refused to take her hand from the plough. She labours as faithfully as ever in the Lord's vineyard, but I see with deepest regret that she is no longer the woman she was even a year ago. The decay has been sudden, and it has been rapid. Her strength begins to fail her, though she will hardly admit as much, even to her medical attendant, and her spirits are less equable than of old. She has intervals of extreme depression, against which the efforts of friendship, the power of spiritual consolation, are unavailing. I feel it my duty to inform you, as one who has a right to be interested in the disposal of Miss Fausset's wealth, that my benefactress has consummated the generosity of past years by a magnificent gift. She has endowed her beloved Church of St. Edmund with an income which, taken in conjunction with the pew rents, an institution which I hope hereafter to abolish, raises the priest of the Temple from penury to comfort, and affords him the means of helping the poor of his parish with his alms as well as with his prayers and ministrations. This munificent gift closes the long account of beneficence betwixt your dear aunt and me. I have nothing further to expect from her for my church or for myself. It is fully understood between us that this gift is final. You will understand, therefore, that I am disinterested in my anxiety for this precious life. You, dear Mrs. Greswold, are your aunt's only near relative, and it is but right you should be the companion and comforter of her declining days. That the shadow of the grave is upon her I can but fear, although medical science sees but slight cause for alarm. A year ago she was a vigorous woman, spare of habit certainly, but with a hardness of bearing and manner which promised a long life. To day she is a broken woman, nervous, fitful, and I fear unhappy, though I can conceive no cause for sadness in the closing years of such a noble life as hers has been, unselfish, devoted to good works and exalted thoughts. If you can find it compatible with your other ties to come to Brighton, I would strongly recommend you to come without loss of time, and I believe the change which you will yourself perceive in my valued friend will fully justify the course I take in thus addressing you. I am ever, dear Mrs. Greswold, your friend and servant, Samuel Maltravers. Mildred gave immediate orders to courier and maid, her trunks were to be packed that afternoon, a coupe was to be taken in the Rapide for the following day, and the travellers were to go straight through to Paris. But when she announced this fact to Pamela, the damsel's countenance expressed utmost despondency. " Upon my word, aunt, you have a genius for taking one away from a place just when one is beginning to be happy," she exclaimed in irrepressible vexation. She apologized directly after, upon hearing of Miss Fausset's illness. " I am a horrid, ill-tempered creature," she said, " but I really am beginning to adore Nice. It is a place that grows upon one. What if I were to leave you with Lady Lochinvar? She told me the other day that she would like very much to have you stay with her. You might stay till she leaves Nice, which will be in about 3 weeks' time, and you could travel with her to Paris. You could go from Paris to Brighton very comfortably, with Peterson to take care of you. Perhaps you would not mind leaving Nice when Lady Lochinvar goes." Pamela sparkled and blushed at the suggestion. " I should like it very much, if Lady Lochinvar is in earnest in asking to have me." " I am sure she is in earnest. There is only one stipulation I must make, Pamela. You must promise me not to renew your intimacy with Mr. Castellani." " With all my heart, aunt. My eyes have been opened. He is thoroughly bad style." End of Chapters 4 and 5. Book 3, Chapter 6 of The Fatal Three by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER VI. As the Sands Run Down. Mildred was in Brighton upon the 3rd day after she left Nice. She had sent no intimation of her coming to her aunt, lest her visit should be forbidden. A nervous invalid is apt to have fancies, and to resent anything that looks like being taken care of. She arrived, therefore, unannounced, left her luggage at the station, and drove straight to Lewes Crescent, where the butler received her with every appearance of surprise. It was early in the afternoon, and Miss Fausset was sitting in her accustomed chair in the back drawing room, near the fire, with her book table on her right hand. The balmy springtime which Mildred had left at Nice had not yet visited Brighton, where the season had been exceptionally cold, and where a jovial north easter was holding his revels all over Kemp Town, and enlivening the cold gray sea. A pleasant, bracing day for robust health and animal spirits, but not altogether the kind of atmosphere to suit an elderly spinster suffering from nervous depression. Miss Fausset started up, flushed with surprise, at Mildred's entrance. Her niece had kept her acquainted with her movements, but had told her nothing of the drama of her existence since she left Brighton. " My dear child, I am very glad to see you back," she said gently. " You are come to stay with me for a little while, I hope, before " She hesitated, and looked at Mildred earnestly. " Are you reconciled to your husband ?" she asked abruptly, as if with irrepressible anxiety. " Reconciled ?" echoed Mildred. " We have never quarrelled. He is as dear to me to day as he was the day I married him dearer for all the years we spent together. But we are parted for ever. You know that it must be so, and you know why. I hoped that time would have taught you common sense." " Time has only confirmed my resolution. Do not let us argue the point, aunt. I know that you mean kindly, but I know that you are false to your own principles to all the teaching of your life when you argue on the side of wrong." Miss Fausset turned her head aside impatiently. She had sunk back into her chair after greeting Mildred, and her niece perceived that she, who used to sit erect as a dart, in the most uncompromising attitude, was now propped up with cushions, against which her wasted figure leaned heavily. " How have you got through the winter, aunt ?" Mildred asked presently. " Not very well. It has tried me more than any other winter I can remember. It has been a long weary winter. I have been obliged to give up the greater part of my district work. I held on as long as ever I could, till my strength failed me ; and now I have to trust the work to others. I have my lieutenants, Emily Newton and her sister, who work for me. You remember them, perhaps ? Earnest, good girls. They keep me en rapport with my poor people ; but it is not like personal intercourse. I begin to feel what it is to be useless, to cumber the ground." " My dear aunt, how can you talk so ? Your life has been so full of usefulness that you may well afford to take rest now that your health is not quite so good as it has been. Even in your drawing room here you are doing good. It is only right that young people should carry out your instructions, and work for you. I have heard, too, of your munificent gift to St. Edmund's." " It is nothing, my dear. When all is counted, it is nothing. I have tried to lead a righteous life. I have tried to do good. But now, sitting alone by this fire day after day, night after night, it all seems vain and empty. There is no comfort in the thought of it all, Mildred. I have had the praise of men, but never the approval of my own conscience." There was a brief silence, Mildred feeling it vain to argue against her aunt's tone of self upbraiding, unable to fathom the mind which prompted the words. " Then you are not going back to your husband ?" Miss Fausset asked abruptly, as if in utter forgetfulness of all that had been said ; and then, suddenly recollecting herself, " You have made up your mind, you say ? Well, in that case you can stay with me, make this your home. You may take up my work, perhaps, by and by." " Yes, aunt, I hope I may be able to do so. My life has been idle and useless since my great sorrow. I want to learn to be of more use in the world, and you can teach me, if you will." " I will, Mildred. I want you to be happy. I have made my will. You will inherit the greater part of my fortune." " My dear aunt, I don't want "" No, you are rich enough already, I know. But I should like you to have still larger means to profit by my death. You will use your wealth for the good of others, as I have tried feebly tried to use mine. You will be rich enough to found a sisterhood, if you like, the Sisters of St. Edmund. I have done all I mean to do for the Church. Mr. Maltravers knows that." " Dear aunt, why should we talk of these things ? You have many years of life before you, I hope." " No, Mildred, the end is not far off. I feel worn out and broken. I am a doomed woman." " But you have had no serious illness since I was here ?"" No, no, nothing specific. Only languor and shattered nerves, want of appetite, want of sleep the sure indications of decay. My doctor can find no name for my malady. He tries one remedy after another, until I weary of his experiments. I am glad you have come to me, Mildred, but I should be gladder if you were going back to your husband." Oh, aunt, why do you say things which you know must torture me?" "Because I am worried by your folly. Well, I will say no more. You will stay with me and comfort me, if you can. What have you done with Pamela?" Mildred told her aunt about Lady Lochinvar's invitation. "Ah, she is with Lady Lochinvar, a very frivolous person, I suppose. Your husband's niece is a well meaning, silly girl, sure to get into mischief of some kind. Is she still in love with Cesar Castellani?" "I think not. I hope not. I believe she is cured of that folly." "You call it a folly? Well, perhaps you are right. It may be foolishness for a girl to follow the blind instinct of her heart." "For an impulsive girl like Pamela." "Yes, no doubt she is impulsive, generous, and uncalculating a girl hardly to be trusted with her own fate," said Miss Fausset, with a sigh, and then she lapsed into silence. Mr. Maltravers had not exaggerated the change in her. It was only too painfully evident. Her manner and bearing had altered since Mildred had seen her last. Physically and mentally her nature seemed to have relaxed and broken down. It was as if the springs that sustained the human machine had snapped. The whole mechanism was out of gear. She who had been so firm of speech and meaning, who had been wont to express herself with a cold and cutting decisiveness, was now feeble and wailing, repeating herself, harping upon the same old string, obviously forgetful of that which had gone before. Mildred felt that she would be only doing her duty in taking up her abode in the great dull house, and trying to soothe the tedium of decay. She could do very little, perhaps, but the fact of near kindred would be in itself a solace, and for her own part she would have the sense of duty done. " I will stay with you as long as you will have me, aunt," she said gently. " Albrecht is below. May I send to the station for my luggage ?"" Of course, and your room shall be got ready immediately. The house will be yours before long, perhaps. It would be strange if you could not make it your home." She touched a spring on her book table which communicated with the electric bell, and Franz appeared promptly. " Tell them to get Mrs. Greswold's old rooms ready at once, and send Albrecht to the station for the luggage," ordered Miss Fausset, with something of her old decisiveness. " Louisa is with you, I suppose ?" she added to her niece. " Louisa is at the station, looking after my things. Albrecht leaves me to day. He has been a good servant, and I think he has had an easy place. I have not been an eager traveller." " No, you seem to have taken life at a slow pace. What took you to Nice ? It is not a place I should have chosen if I wanted quiet." Mildred hesitated for some moments before she replied to this question. " You know one part of my sorrow, aunt, and I think I might trust you with the whole of that sad story. I went to Nice because it was the place where my husband lived with his first wife, where my unhappy sister died." " She died at Nice ?" repeated Miss Fausset, with an abstracted air, as if her power of attention, which had revived for a little just now, were beginning to flag. " She died there, under the saddest circumstances. I am heartbroken when I think of her and that sad fate. My own dear Fay, how hard that your loving heart should be an instrument of self torture. She was jealous of her husband, causelessly, unreasonably jealous, and she killed herself in a paroxysm of despair." The awfulness of this fact aroused Miss Fausset from her apathy. She started up from amongst her cushions, staring at Mildred in mute horror, and her wasted hands trembled as they grasped the arm of her chair. " Surely, surely that can't be true," she faltered. " It is too dreadful. People tell such lies an accident, perhaps, exaggerated into a suicide an overdose of an opiate." " No, no, it was nothing like that. There is no doubt. I heard it from those who knew. She flung herself over the edge of the cliff. She was walking with her husband my husband George Greswold, then George Ransome. They were walking together. They quarrelled. He said something that stung her to the quick, and she threw herself over the cliff. It was the wild impulse of a moment, for which an all merciful God would not hold her accountable. She was in very delicate health, nervous, hysterical, and she fancied herself unloved, betrayed, perhaps. Ah, aunt, think how hardly she had been used cast off, disowned, sent out alone in the world, by those who should have loved and protected her. Poor, poor Fay ! My mother sent her away from The Hook, where she was so happy. My mother's jealousy drove her out a young girl, so friendless, so lonely, so much in need of love. It was my mother's doing, but my father ought not to have allowed it. If she was weak he was strong, and Fay was his daughter. It was his duty to protect her against all the world. You know how I loved my father. You know that I reverence his memory, but he played a coward's part when he sent Fay out of his house to please my mother." She was carried away by her passionate regret for that ill used girl whose image had never lost its hold upon her heart. " Not a word against your father, Mildred. He was a good man. He never failed in affection or in duty. He acted for the best according to his lights in relation to that unhappy girl unhappy, ill used yes, yes, yes. He did his best, Mildred. He must not be blamed. But it is dreadful to think that she killed herself." " Had you heard nothing of her fate, aunt ? My father must have been told, surely. There must have been some means of communication. He must have kept himself informed about her fate, although she was banished, given over to the care of strangers. If he had owned a dog which other people took care of for him, he would have been told when the dog died." Miss Fausset felt the unspeakable bitterness of this comparison. " You must not speak like that of your father, Mildred. You ought to know that he was a good man. Yes, he knew, of course, when that poor girl died, but it was not his business to tell other people. I only heard incidentally that she had married, and that she died within a year of her marriage. I heard no more. It was the end of a sad story." Again there was an interval of silence. It was 6:00. The sun was going down over the sea beyond the west pier, and the lawn, and the fashionable garden where the gay world congregates ; and this eastern end of the long white sea front was lapsing into greyness, through which a star shone dimly here and there. It looked a cold, dull world after the pink hotel and the green shutters, the dusty palms and the turquoise sea of the Promenade des Anglais. But Mildred was glad to be in England, glad to be so much nearer him whose life companion she could never be again. Franz brought her some tea presently, and informed her that her rooms were ready, and that Louisa had arrived with the luggage. Albrecht had left his humble duty for his honoured mistress, and was gone. " When your father died, you looked through his papers and letters, no doubt," said Miss Fausset presently, after a pause in the conversation. " Yes, aunt, I looked through my dear father's letters, and arranged everything with our old family solicitor, Mr. Cresswell," answered Mildred, surprised at a question which seemed to have no bearing upon anything that had gone before. " And you found no documents relating to that unhappy girl ?"" Not a line, not a word. But I had not expected to find anything. The history of her birth was the one dark secret of my father's life. He would naturally leave no trace of the story." " Naturally, if he were wiser than most people. But I have observed that men of business have a passion for preserving documents, even when they are worthless. People keep compromising papers with the idea of destroying them on their death beds or when they feel the end is near, and then death comes without warning and the papers remain. Your father's end was somewhat sudden." " Sadly sudden. When he left Enderby in the autumn he was in excellent health. The shooting had been better than usual that year, and I think he had enjoyed it as much as the youngest of our party. And then he went back to London and the London fogs, caught cold, neglected himself, and we were summoned to Parchment Street to find him dying of inflammation of the lungs. It was terrible such a brief farewell, such an irreparable loss." " I was not sent for," said Miss Fausset severely, " and yet I loved your father dearly." " It was wrong, aunt, but we hoped against hope almost to the last. It was only within a few hours of the end that we knew the case was hopeless, and to summon you would have been to give him the idea that he was dying. George and I pretended that our going to him was accidental. We were so fearful of alarming him." " Well, I daresay you acted for the best ; but it was a heavy blow for me to be told that he was gone my only brother almost my only friend." " Pray don't say that, aunt. I hope you know that I love you." " My dear, you love me because I am your father's sister. You consider it your duty to love me. My brother loved me for my own sake. He was a noble hearted man." Miss Fausset and her niece dined together tete a tete, and spent the evening quietly on each side of the hearth, with their books and work, the kind of work which encourages pensive brooding as the needle travels slowly over the fabric. " I wonder you have no pets, aunt no favourite dog." " I have never cared for that kind of affection, Mildred. I am of too hard a nature, perhaps. My heart does not open itself to dogs and cats, and parrots are my abomination. I am not like the typical spinster. My only solace in the long weary years has been in going among people who are more unhappy than myself. I have put myself face to face with sordid miseries, with heavy lifelong burdens, and I have asked myself, what is your trouble compared with these? Dear aunt, it seems to me that your life must have been particularly free from trouble and care. Perhaps in its outward aspect. I am rich, and I have been looked up to. But do you think those long years of loneliness, the aimless, monotonous pilgrimage through life, have not been a burden? Do you think I have not, sometimes at any rate, envied other women their children and their husbands, the atmosphere of domestic love, even with its attendant cares and sorrows? Do you suppose that I could live for a quarter of a century as I have lived, and not feel the burden of my isolation? I have made people care for me through their self-interest. I have made people honour me, because I have the means of helping them. But who is there who cares for me, Gertrude Fausset? You cannot have done so much for others without being sincerely loved in return." " With a kind of love, perhaps, a love that has been bought." " Why did you never marry, aunt ?"" Because I was an heiress and a good match, and distrusted every man who wanted to marry me. I made a vow to myself, before my 20th birthday, that I would never listen to words of love or give encouragement to a lover, and I most scrupulously kept that vow. I was called a handsome woman in those days, but I was not an attractive woman at any time. Nature had made me of too hard a clay. It was a pity that you should keep love at arm's length. Far better to have been fooled by shams, as I might have been. Don't say any more about it, Mildred. I made my vow, and I kept it." Mildred resigned herself quietly to the idea of the dull slow life in Lewes Crescent. This duty of solacing her aunt's declining days was the only duty that remained to her, except that wider duty of caring for the helpless and the wretched. And she told herself that there could be no better school in which to learn how to help others than the house of Miss Fausset, who had given so much of her life to the poor. She had been told to consider her aunt's house as her own, and that she was at liberty to receive Pamela there as much and as often as she liked. She did not think that Pamela would be long without a settled home. Mr. Stuart's admiration and Lady Lochinvar's wishes had been obvious ; and Mildred daily expected a gushing letter from the fickle damsel announcing her engagement to the Scotchman. At 4:00 on the day after Mildred's arrival, Miss Fausset's friends began to drop in for afternoon tea and talk, and Mildred was surprised to see how her aunt rallied in that long familiar society. It seemed as if the praises and flatteries of these people acted upon her like strong wine. The languid attitude, the weary expression of the pale drawn face, were put aside. She sat erect again. Her eyes brightened, her ear was alert to follow 3 or 4 conversations at a time. Nothing escaped her. Mildred began to think that she had lived upon the praises of men rather than upon the approval of conscience, that these assiduities and flatteries of a very commonplace circle were essential to her happiness. Mr. Maltravers came after the vesper service, full of life and conversation, vigorous, self-satisfied, with an air of papal dominion and papal infallibility, so implicitly believed in by his flock that he had learned to believe as implicitly in himself. The flock was chiefly feminine, and worshipped without limit or reservation. There were husbands and sons, brothers and nephews, who went to church with their womankind on Sunday, but those were for the most part without enthusiasm for Mr. Maltravers. Their idea of public worship went scarcely beyond considering Sunday morning service a respectable institution, not to be dispensed with lightly. Mr. Maltravers welcomed Mildred with touching friendliness. " I knew you would not fail your aunt in the hour of need," he said. " And now I hope you are going to stay with her and to take up her work when she lays it down, so that the golden thread of womanly charity may be unbroken." " I hope I may be able to take up her work. I shall stay with her as long as she needs me." " That is well. You found her sadly changed, did you not ?"" Yes, she is much changed. Yet how bright she looks this afternoon ! What interest she takes in the conversation !"" The flash of the falchion in the worn out scabbard," said Mr. Maltravers. A layman might have said sword, but Mr. Maltravers preferred falchion as a more picturesque word. Half the success of his preaching had lain in the choice of picturesque words. There were sceptics among his masculine congregation who said there were no ideas in his sermons. only fine words, romantic similes, a perpetual recurrence of fountains and groves, sunset splendours and roseate dawns, golden gates and starry canopies, seas of glass, harps of gold. But if his female worshippers felt better and holier after listening to him, what could one ask more? And they all declared that it was so. They came out of church spiritualized, overflowing with Christian love, and gave their pence eagerly to the crossing sweepers on their way home. The dropping in and the tea drinking went on for nearly 2 hours. Mr. Maltravers took 4 cups of tea, and consumed a good deal of bread and butter, abstaining from the chocolate biscuits and the pound cake which the ladies of the party affected, abstaining on principle, as saints and eremites of old abstained from high living. He allowed himself to enjoy the delicate aroma of the tea and delicately cut bread and butter. He was a bachelor, and lived poorly upon badly cooked food at his vicarage. His only personal indulgence was in the accumulation of a theological library, in which all the books were of a high church caste. When the visitors were all gone, Miss Fausset sank back into her chair, white and weary looking, and Mildred left her to take a little nap while she went up to her own room, half boudoir, half dressing room, a spacious apartment with a fine sea view. Here she sat in a reverie, and watched the fading sky and the slow dim stars creeping out one by one. Was she really to take up her aunt's work, to live in a luxurious home, a lonely, loveless woman, and to go out in a methodical, almost mechanical way so many times a week to visit among the poor? Would such a life as that satisfy her in all the long, slow years? The time would come, perhaps, when she would find peace in such a life, when her heart would know no grief except the grief of others, when she would have cast off the fetters of selfish cares and selfish yearnings, and would stand alone, as saints and martyrs and holy women of old had stood, alone with God and his poor. There were women, she knew, even in these degenerate days, who so lived and so worked, seeking no guerdon but the knowledge of good done in this world, and the hope of the crown immortal. Her day of sacrifice had not yet come. She had not been able to dissever her soul from the hopes and sorrows of earth. She had not been able to forget the husband she had forsaken, even for a single hour. When she knelt down to pray at night, when she woke in the morning, her thoughts were with him. How does he bear his solitude? Has he learnt to forget me and to be happy? Those questions were ever present to her mind. And now, at Brighton, knowing herself so near him, her heart yearned more than ever for the sight of the familiar face, for the sound of the beloved voice. She pored over the time table, and calculated the length of the journey, the time lost at Portsmouth and Bishopstoke, every minute until the arrival at Romsey, and then the drive to Enderby. She pictured the lanes in the early May, the hedgerows bursting into leaf, the banks where the primroses were opening, the tender young ferns just beginning to uncurl their feathery fronds, the spear points of the hart's tongue shooting up amidst rank broad docks, and lords and ladies, and the flower on the leafless black thorn making patches of white amongst the green. How easy it was to reach him, how natural it would seem to hasten to him after half a year of exile, and yet she must not. She had pledged herself to honour the law, to obey the letter and the spirit of that harsh law which decreed that her sister's husband could not be hers. She knew that he was at Enderby, and she had some ground for supposing that he was well and even contented. She had seen the letters which he had written to his niece. He had written about the shooting, his horses, his dogs, and there had been no word to indicate that he was out of health or in low spirits. Mildred had pored over those brief letters, forgetting to return them to their rightful owner, cherishing them as if they made a kind of link between her and the love she had resigned. How firm the hand was, that fine and individual penmanship which she had so admired in the past, the hand in which her first love letter had been written. It was but little altered in 15 years. She recalled the happy hour when she received that first letter from her affianced husband. He had gone to London a day or two after their betrothal, eager to make all arrangements for their marriage, impatient for settlements and legal machinery which should make their union irrevocable, full of plans for immediate improvements at Enderby. She remembered how she ran out into the garden to read that first letter, a long letter, though they had been parted less than a day when it was written. She had gone to the remotest nook in that picturesque riverside garden, a rustic bower by the water's edge, an osier arbour over which her own hands had trained the Silene Forestieri roses. They were in flower on that happy day. clusters of pale yellow bloom breathing perfume round her as she sat beneath the blossoming arch and devoured her lover's fond words. Oh, how bright life had been then for both of them, for her without a cloud. He was well, that was something to know, but it was not enough. Her heart yearned for fuller knowledge of his life than those letters gave. Wounded pride might have prompted that cheerful tone. He might wish her to think him happy and at ease without her. He thought that she had used him ill. It was natural, perhaps, that he should think so, since he could not see things as she saw them. He had not her deep-rooted convictions. She thought of him and wondered about him till the desire for further knowledge grew into an aching pain. She must write to some one. She must do something to quiet this gnawing anxiety. In her trouble she thought of all her friends in the neighbourhood of Enderby, but there was none in whom she could bring herself to confide except Rollinson, the curate. She had thought first of writing to the doctor, but he was something of a gossip, and would be likely to prattle to his patients about her letter, and her folly in forsaking so good a husband. Rollinson she felt she might trust. He was a thoughtful young man, despite his cheery manners and some inclination to facetiousness of a strictly clerical order. He was one of a large family, and had known trouble, and Mildred had been especially kind to him and to the sisters who from time to time had shared his apartments at the carpenter's, and had revelled in the gaieties of Enderby parish, the penny reading at the schoolhouse, the sale of work for the benefit of the choir, and an occasional afternoon for tea and tennis at the Manor. Those maiden sisters of the curate's had known and admired Lola, and Mr. Rollinson had been devoted to her from his first coming to the parish, when she was a lovely child of 7. Mildred wrote fully and frankly to the curate. " I cannot enter upon the motive of our separation," she wrote, " except so far as to tell you that it is a question of principle which has parted us. My husband has been blameless in all his domestic relations, the best of husbands, the noblest of men. Loving him with all my heart, trusting and honouring him as much as on my wedding day, I yet felt it my duty to leave him. I should not make this explanation to any one else at Enderby, but I wish you to know the truth. If people ever question you about my reasons, you can tell them that it is my intention ultimately to enter an Anglican sisterhood, or it may be to found a sisterhood, and to devote my declining years to my sorrowing fellow creatures. This is my fixed intention, but my vocation is yet weak. My heart cleaves to the old home and all that I lost in leaving it. And now, my kind friend, I want you to tell me how my husband fares in his solitude. If he were ill and unhappy he would be too generous to complain to me. Tell me how he is in health and spirits. Tell me of his daily life, his amusements, occupations. There is not the smallest detail which will not interest me. You see him, I hope, often. Certainly you are likely to see him oftener than any one else in the parish. Tell me all you can, and be assured of my undying gratitude. Ever sincerely yours, Mildred Greswold. Mr. Rollinson's reply came by return of post. I am very glad you have written to me, dear Mrs. Greswold. Had I known your address, I think I should have taken the initiative and written to you. Believe me, I respect your motive for the act which has, I fear, cast a blight upon a good man's life. And I will venture to say no more than that the motive should be a very strong one which forces you to persevere in a course that has wrecked your husband's happiness, and desolated one of the most delightful and most thoroughly Christian homes I had ever the privilege of entering. I look back and recall what Enderby Manor was, and I think what it is now, and I can hardly compare those two pictures without tears. You ask me to tell you frankly all I can tell you about your husband's mode of life, his health and spirits. All I can tell is summed up in 4 words. His heart is broken. In my deep concern about his desolate position, in my heartfelt regard for him, I have ventured to force my society upon him sometimes when I could not doubt it was unwelcome. He received me with all his old kindness of manner, but I am sympathetic enough to know when a man only endures my company, and I know that his feeling was at best endurance. But I believe that he trusts me, and that he was less upon his guard with me than he is with other acquaintances. I have seen him put on an appearance of cheerfulness with other people. I have heard him talk to other people as if life had in nowise lost its interest for him. With me he dropped the mask. I saw him brooding by his hearth, as he broods when he is alone. I heard his involuntary sighs. I saw the image of a shipwrecked existence. Indeed, Mrs. Greswold, there is nothing else that I can tell you if you would have me truthful. You have broken his heart. You have sacrificed your love to a principle, you say. You should be very sure of your principle. You ask me as to his habits and occupations. I believe they are about as monotonous as those of a galley slave. He walks a great deal, in all weathers and at all hours, but rarely beyond his own land. I don't think he often rides, and he has not hunted once during the season. He did a little shooting in October and November, quite alone. He has had no staying visitor within his doors since you left him. I have reason to know that he goes to the churchyard every evening at dusk, and spends some time beside your daughter's grave. I have seen him there several times when it was nearly dark, and he had no apprehension of being observed. You know how rarely any one enters our quiet little burial ground, and how complete a solitude it is at that twilight hour. I am about the only passer-by, and even I do not pass within sight of the old yew tree above your darling's resting place unless I go a little out of my way between the vestry door and the lych gate. I have often gone out of my way to note that lonely figure by the grave. Be assured, dear Mrs. Greswold, that in sending you this gloomy picture of a widowed life I have had no wish to distress you. I have exaggerated nothing. I wish you to know the truth, and if it lies within your power, without going against your conscience, to undo that which you have done, I entreat you to do so without delay. There may not be much time to be lost. Believe me, devotedly and gratefully your friend, Frederick Rollinson. Mildred shed bitter tears over the Curate's letter. How different the picture it offered from that afforded by George Greswold's own letters, in which he had written cheerily of the shooting, the dogs and horses, the changes in the seasons, and the events of the outer world. That frank, easy tone had been part of his armour of pride. He would not abase himself by the admission of his misery. He had guessed, no doubt, that his wife would read those letters, and he would not have her know the extent of the ruin she had wrought. She thought of him in his solitude, pictured him beside their child's grave, and the longing to look upon him once more, unseen by him, if it could be so, became irresistible. She determined to see with her own eyes if he were as unhappy as Mr. Rollinson supposed. She, who knew him so well, would be better able to judge by his manner and bearing, better able to divine the inner workings of his heart and mind. It had been a habit of her life to read his face, to guess his thoughts before they found expression in words. He had never been able to keep a secret from her, except that one long hidden story of the past, and even there she had known that there was something. She had seen the shadow of that abiding remorse. " I am going to leave you for 2 days, aunt," she said rather abruptly, on the morning after she received Rollinson's letter. " I want to look at Lola's grave. I shall go from here to Enderby as fast as the train will take me, spend an hour in the churchyard, go on to Salisbury for the night, and come back to you to morrow afternoon." " You mean that you are going back to your husband ?"" No, no. I may see him, perhaps, by accident. I shall not enter the Manor House. I am going to the churchyard, nowhere else." " You would be wiser if you went straight home. Remember years hence, when I am dead and gone, that I told you as much. You must do as you like. Stay at an inn at Salisbury while your own beautiful home is empty, or anything else that is foolish and wrong headed. You had better let Franz go with you." " Thanks, aunt. I would not take him away on any account. I can get on quite well by myself." She left Brighton at midday, lost a good deal of time at the two junctions, and drove to within a few hundred yards of Enderby Church just as the bright May day was melting into evening. There was a path across some meadows at the back of the village that led to the churchyard. She stopped the fly by the meadow gate, and told the man to drive round to Mr. Rollinson's lodgings and wait for her there ; and then she walked slowly along the narrow footpath, between the long grass, golden with buttercups in the golden evening. It was a lovely evening. There was a little wood of oaks and chestnuts on her left hand as she approached the churchyard, and the shrubberies of Enderby Manor were on her right. The trees she knew so well, her own trees, the tall mountain ash and the clump of beeches, rose above the lower level of lilacs and laburnums, acacia and rose maple. There was a nightingale singing in the thick foliage yonder. There was always a nightingale at this season somewhere in the shrubbery. She had lingered many a time with her husband to listen to that unmistakable melody. The dark foliage of the churchyard made an inky blot midst all that vernal greenery. Those immemorial yews, which knew no change with the changing years, spread their broad shadows over the lowly graves, and made night in God's acre while it was yet day in the world outside. Mildred went into the churchyard as if into the realm of death. The shadows closed round her on every side, and the change from light to gloom chilled her as she walked slowly towards the place where her child was lying. Yes, he was there, just as the curate had told her. He stood leaning against the long horizontal branch of the old yew, looking down at the marble which bore his daughter's name. He was very pale, and his sunken eyes and hollow cheeks told of failing health. He stood motionless in a gloomy reverie. His wife watched him from a little way off. She stood motionless as himself stood and watched him till the beating of her heart sounded so loud in her own ears that she thought he too must hear that passionate throbbing. She had thought when she set out on her journey that it would be sufficient for her just to see him, and that having seen him she would go away and leave him without his ever knowing that she had looked upon him. But now the time had come it was not enough. The impulse to draw nearer and to speak to him was too strong to be denied. She went with tottering footsteps to the side of the grave, and called him by his name. " George, George," holding out her hands to him piteously. CHAPTER VII.